The wind came in flat across the Wyoming plain, carrying dust and nothing else. The kind of wind that had been making the same crossing every summer since before anyone alive could remember. It moved through the dry grass without ceremony and continued west without looking back. Out past the edge of Cheyenne, where the last sounds of town finally gave up following you, the land opened into something vast and without opinion, and a man could disappear into a morning's work without anyone marking his absence. Calhoun Briggs had arranged his life specifically around that quality. He was 44 years old, and he carried those years in the set of his shoulders and the economy of how he moved through the world. Not a large man, but dense with purpose, the way old timber is dense, something that has been tested by weather and compression and has arrived at its final form through pressure rather than intention. His hands were the hands of someone who had done careful work and rough work in roughly equal measure, and they moved along the fence wire that morning with the practiced ease of a man who no longer needed to think about what his hands were doing. He had been on this particular stretch of land for going on 3 years, leasing it from a man in Denver who had never once come out to see it. The barn needed work in the places barns always needed work. The well ran shallow in August. The house was small enough that a man living alone never had to negotiate with the silence because the silence filled it without being asked and stayed without needing encouragement. Calhoun had not minded any of this. He had chosen it in the deliberate way that a man chooses something not because it makes him happy, but because it asks of him exactly what he is prepared to give, and nothing more. That was the arrangement. That was what had been working. He pulled the wire taut and reached for his pliers. The sun was already high and without mercy. Sweat darkened the back of his shirt, and the skin along the back of his neck had gone the color of old leather from years of this particular kind of morning. He didn't look up often. The plain stretched in every direction and said the same thing no matter where you pointed your eyes. Flat, dry, honest in its indifference. He had come here after the war, though not in any straight line. There had been years between the war's end in this fence line that he didn't account for, in conversation, years of cattle drives and freighting work, and one long winter as a night watchman at a Colorado mill that closed before spring. He had not been running from anything exactly. It was more that he had never found a sufficient reason to stop moving, and after enough years of that, the motion itself becomes a kind of address. What had finally stopped him here was nothing dramatic. A piece of land at a manageable price, and a landlord who asked no questions, and a county quiet enough that a man could go a week without being required to explain himself to anyone. That was enough. That had been enough for 3 years. Chikamaga had done something to him that the other years of the war had not quite managed. He had served as a field medic for 2 years before that battle, and he had learned in those years what the body could endure before it simply stopped. And he had learned to work with steady hands in conditions designed to make steady hands impossible, and he had been good at it in the grim and unrewarding way a man can be good at something he wishes didn't need doing. But Chikamaga had asked something different of him. He did not think about it in complete sentences anymore. It lived in him the way an old injury lives in a joint present when the weather changed something he had stopped expecting to resolve. He had made a choice in those woods in September of 1863, and he had been making the inverse of that choice every day since trying to calculate what kind of man it made him, and never arriving at an answer he could rest comfortably inside. What he had arrived at instead was this fence line, this leased land, a life arranged carefully around the principle of not being required to make that kind of choice again. He was working on the third post from the southeast corner when something at the edge of his vision made him stop. He didn't turn immediately. A man who spent enough time alone in open country developed a sensitivity to movement, the way a blind man develops sensitivity to sound. Not dramatic, not urgent, just a quiet awareness that something in the landscape had changed. He set his pliers on the fence rail and straightened slowly and turned to look. About 200 yards out near the flat shelf of rock along the dry creek bed, something had gone down. Not an animal, a person. A shape that had been moving and was now staying still. Calhoun stood and looked at it. He was not a man who acted out of panic. He assessed the shape for several seconds, deciding what it was and what it likely meant. Human. Down. Staying down. What had put it there was not yet clear, and in this part of the country, that was not a question a careful man rushed toward without consideration. He picked up his hat from the fence post, put it on, and walked toward the shape. He walked at his ordinary pace without urgency. The dry grass crackled under his boots. The sun pressed down on the back of his neck. The shape resolved itself as he closed the distance. A woman. Young, he thought. Not a girl, but young. She had pulled herself upright onto the rock, and her legs hung over the side of it in the helpless way that limbs arrange themselves when the body has stopped accepting instructions from the mind. She was facing away from him. Her dress was torn across the back and along one shoulder, fabric hanging where it had no right to hang. One knee was swollen and darkly bruised, visible even at this distance. Her feet were bare and coated in the pale dust of the plain. He was about 30 feet away when she heard him. She turned with the speed of someone whose body has been trained to brace for what arrives from behind, and she put her hands up between herself and him in a gesture that was not quite surrender and not quite defense, but something in between, something that lives in the space between those two things, in people who have spent a long time needing to occupy that space. Calhoun stopped walking immediately. He stood at 30 feet, and he took his hat off slowly so she could see his face without the shadow of the brim between them. He kept his hands where she could see them. He said nothing. He simply waited. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark and sharp, and whatever else had been taken from her in whatever had preceded this morning, sharpness had not been among it. Her face was drawn tight with exhaustion, of the kind that has been accumulating not for hours, but for much longer, the kind that reaches past tired and becomes structural. There was a cut along her jawline, half-healed and several days old. Her lower lip was swollen on one side in a way that was at least 2 days past its worst. She said, her voice carrying the rasp of someone who had been breathing dust for a long time. "You need to turn around and go back the way you came." Calhoun said, "All right." She hadn't expected that. A pause. "I mean it." "I can see that," he said. He turned his hat once in his hands, a slow rotation that was simply habit, simply thinking. "I have water if you need it. I won't come closer without permission." She looked at him the way a person looks at a door they're not certain leads where it claims to lead, measuring the gap between the promise of the thing and the likelihood of its truth. "Who are you?" she said. "Calhoun Briggs. I lease the property east of the creek. I was mending fence when I saw you go down." He let that settle. "You've been walking since before the sun came up." She looked down at her feet. Something in her face completed a calculation she'd been running. She said nothing. He stepped toward the rock slowly, and when she didn't pull back, he took another step. He crouched about 10 feet from her and set his canteen on the flat rock in the space between them, then moved back to where he'd been. He had learned this from working with soldiers in shock. You didn't hand things to frighten people. You placed things in the distance between you and stepped back and let them decide. She watched him do it. Then she reached forward and took the canteen in both hands, and her hands were shaking badly enough that water ran down her chin before the first swallow, and she didn't seem to notice. She drank and then held the canteen against her chest and looked out across the plain at the middle distance. Calhoun stayed where he was. After a while, she said, still looking at the distance, "The man who did this, his family has reach in this part of the county." "Tell me the name," Calhoun said. She didn't answer that. Not yet. She did something instead that he would carry for a long time. She said, "Before I tell you anything, I want you to understand what you'd be walking into." Then she turned slowly and pulled aside the torn fabric at her back, enough for him to see what was there. The bruises were layered. That was the thing he registered first, and it was the thing that mattered most. Not a single incident, not one bad night or one fall downstairs, but a record long and deliberate, kept in the language of damage on muscle and skin. Old marks gone yellow and green beneath fresh ones. A pattern with the consistency of something repeated over time, something that had been permitted to continue because nothing and no one had stood in its way. Calhoun looked at what she was showing him. He did not look away. He did not give himself the relief of looking away because she had not had that relief, and looking away from what she was showing him would be a version of the same choice that had allowed it to continue this long. He had seen worse technically. The war had given him an education in damage that he carried permanently. But battlefield wounds were impersonal, the indiscriminate result of forces aimed at everything and no one. What he was looking at now had been aimed at one specific person, repeatedly with intention and time. The difference between a storm and a choice is the difference between those two kinds of damage, and that difference was not small. He exhaled quietly through his nose. "How long were you on foot this morning?" She pulled the fabric back. "Since before the sun, I don't know exactly how far." A pause. I hit wire twice in the dark. He could see it now. The cuts along her forearms from the barbed wire she'd crossed in the pre-dawn black. The parallel scratches on her left shin. She had been running across unfenced range in the dark, cutting across property lines without knowing whose, trying to put distance between herself and wherever she had started. "You need more water," he said, "and there's shade at the barn." She looked at him, that measuring look again shaped by too many experiences of trusting the wrong read on a person. "I'm not walking anywhere with a man I don't know." "Fair enough," Calhoun said. "I'll go get the water and bring it here." He walked back to the barn without another word, and behind him he heard the sound of her exhaling a long and quiet release of breath that had been held against the likelihood of something that hadn't happened. He came back with a full canteen, a tin cup, a strip of clean cloth, and a small jar of the salve he kept for fence cuts and horse scrapes, which worked on human skin without pretension. He set everything in the space between them, sat down on the ground against the fence rail about 15 feet back, and pushed his hat up on his head. She processed the supplies methodically. She refilled the cup twice. She pressed the cloth against the cut on her jaw. She left the salve where he'd placed it, which told him the worst of the injuries were ones she couldn't easily reach herself. "Desa Vane," she said finally. A name offered as a transaction, not a greeting. "Calhoun Briggs," he said again unnecessarily. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. "I know who did this," she said. "And if you've been out here any length of time, you'll know the name too." "Tell me," he said. She looked at him directly for the first time straight on, without the sideways assessment. She held it for a moment, that look as if she were testing the weight of what she was about to place on the air between them. Then she said it. "Sutton Greer." The name sat in the Wyoming heat, and the flat wind moved past it and didn't take it anywhere. Calhoun said nothing for a moment. He turned his hat in his hands once, twice, the slow rotation of a man thinking. Sutton Greer. He knew the name. Anyone who had spent more than a season within a half-day's ride of Cheyenne knew the name, not because Greer held any official position or had done anything that could be pointed to cleanly in a court of law, but because he was the kind of man whose name moved through a community the way certain weather moved through it, noted and given a wide berth, discussed in lowered voices when he wasn't present. The Greer family had roots in this part of Wyoming that went back before the railroad, and like most things rooted deeply in one place for a long time, they had grown in shapes that suited themselves rather than shapes that suited the land around them. Sutton Greer specifically had built a reputation made of money and influence, and the particular immunity that grows around a man when enough people have decided that opposing him costs more than they're willing to spend. Calhoun had made certain across 3 years not to have occasion to deal with him. It was part of the arrangement, the careful management of a life kept at sufficient distance from other people's difficulties, that those difficulties remain theirs. He looked at Desa Vane sitting on that rock in the July heat with her cut feet and her layered bruises, and her canteen held in 2 hands that had finally stopped shaking, and something inside him that he had kept packed away and well sealed for 15 years shifted against its containment. "Is he your husband?" Calhoun said. "My husband's brother," Desa said. The word husband came out with a flat finality, like a door that has been shut so many times it no longer swings cleanly in either direction. "Fletcher married me 3 years ago. Sutton came with the arrangement." She stopped, then with something careful and stripped down in her voice. "Fletcher knows. He's known the whole time." Calhoun sat with that. He didn't ask why Fletcher hadn't stopped it, because he already knew the shape of that answer. He had known men like Fletcher Vane in the war, men who lived in the distance between a thing happening and the action required to stop it, and who chose again and again to remain in that distance rather than cross it. Not wicked men, just men whose fear of one consequence had grown large enough to crowd out every other instinct, including the ones that should have mattered most. He was still sitting with all of it when he heard the sound of hooves. Not one horse, more than one. 3 at least, from the weight and rhythm of it, coming along the road from the east at a pace that was unhurried and deliberate, the pace of men who were not searching because they already knew where to look. Calhoun stood. He turned toward the road and watched 3 riders come over the low rise. They moved in that specific loose formation that isn't quite a group and isn't quite individuals, the formation of men who have done things together before and don't need to discuss positioning. The lead rider was tall in the saddle, angular, sitting his horse, with the ease of a man for whom that posture required no thought. He wore a hat pulled low and a scar along one cheekbone, pale and permanent, the kind earned in bad circumstances and never mentioned. Sutton Greer. Behind him, Desa had gone completely still on the rock. Not the stillness of shock, the stillness of a person who had calculated this likelihood and had simply been deciding what to do when it arrived. "He found the trail," she said very quietly. Calhoun kept his eyes on the riders. "How long were you planning to be gone before he'd come looking?" A pause. "I wasn't planning," she said. "I was just running." The riders came on. Greer brought his horse to a stop about 40 yards out, and his two men spread slightly to his left and right, not dramatically, just enough to establish the geometry of the thing. Greer looked at Calhoun for a moment without speaking. Then he looked past Calhoun at Desa, and something moved across his face that was too brief and too controlled to fully identify. But it was not the look of a man relieved to have located someone he'd been worried about. It was the look of a man reacquiring something he considered his. He looked back at Calhoun. "That woman is a relation by marriage," he said. His voice was even almost pleasant, carrying the careful absence of urgency that some men use as a demonstration of how little they feel threatened. "She left in a state," the family's concerned. "She doesn't look like she left in a state," Calhoun said. "She looks like she left in a hurry." Greer tilted his head slightly, the gesture of a man acknowledging a distinction he found uninteresting. "Same thing in this case." "I'd say those are considerably different things," Calhoun said. One of the riders shifted in his saddle. Greer didn't look at him. "You're the Briggs man, leasing the Hawkins place." Not a question. The ease with which he produced it was deliberate, a small demonstration of reach. "That's right," Calhoun said. "Then you understand this isn't your business," Greer said. Still pleasant, still level. "This is a family matter, and I'd ask you to step aside." Calhoun did not step aside. He stood in the July heat and said, "I found this woman 200 yards from my fence line. She's been walking since dark. She has marks on her that don't come from a fall." He let that settle. "So before anyone goes anywhere, I think we should ride into Cheyenne and let Sheriff Puit take a look at the situation." Something shifted in the way Greer sat his horse, a fractional redistribution of weight, a settling. "No call to bring the law into a family matter," he said. "Then let's make sure it's only a family matter," Calhoun said. A silence. The flat wind moved through the grass between them. Then the rider on Greer's left came off his horse in a quick motion, hand going to his belt, and moved toward the rock where Desa was sitting. He moved fast for his size and wasn't looking at Calhoun, which was his error. Calhoun covered the distance in 3 strides, picked up the long-handled shovel leaning against the fence post where he'd left it that morning, and brought it down in a short, precise arc across the outside of the man's right forearm. Metal on bone. The man's hand opened by reflex. Something hit the dirt. The man grabbed his arm and staggered back, making a low sound. The second rider came in from the right while Calhoun's weight was still forward. Calhoun turned into it rather than away, took the man's shoulder into his own chest, and absorbed the impact across his left side, where it would bruise but not break, then drove his right elbow back hard across the man's jaw. The man's knees went soft, and he sat down heavily against the water trough. Calhoun stepped back and set the shovel against the fence post. He was breathing harder. His left shoulder was registering its complaint with the clarity of a joint that remembered being younger. He kept his eyes on Sutton Greer. Greer had not moved. He sat on his horse and observed the 2 men on the ground, and then looked at Calhoun, and he did all of it with the unhurried attention of a man assessing a property he was considering purchasing. No anger, no alarm, just that steady measuring calm. The absence of surprise in his face was the unsettling part. Not the confrontation itself, the fact that it had all been factored in already. Greer looked past Calhoun at Desa one more time, then back at Calhoun. "All right," he said. His voice had not changed registers. "We'll ride in and speak with Puit." He said it the way a man agrees to an alternate route when he is already certain of the destination. Calhoun registered that, the ease of it, the absence of resistance where resistance should have been present. Men like Greer didn't concede. They had never needed to learn how. The fact that this one had agreed so readily meant one of 2 things: either he had assessed the legal path as the cleanest option available, or he had already walked it. He had already been down that road, and whatever waited at the end of it was already in place. Calhoun turned briefly to look at Desa. She was watching Greer, and her face had moved into something older than fear, Something that looked like recognition, like a person identifying whether they had survived before and knew the full shape of from inside it. Her jaw was set. Her hands had stopped shaking entirely. The man with the hurt arm was back on his feet, cradling his wrist. The second man had gotten up from the trough, wiping blood from his mouth with the expression of a man who intended to remember. Neither looked to Greer for instruction. They simply moved back into position behind him. They rode toward Cheyenne. Calhoun kept Desa to his left and kept Sutton Greer in his peripheral vision the entire way. The road ran straight and pale through the dry grass. The town came up on the horizon gradually, the way towns do on flat ground, first as shapes, then as buildings, then as a place with noise and heat and the smell of a working summer afternoon. Greer rode the whole way without restlessness, without the visible tension that should have been present in a man heading toward a reckoning he hadn't chosen. He rode like a man returning somewhere expected, like a man who had already arranged the furniture in the room they were all walking into. It was that quality, that specific, unsettling ease that had Calhoun's jaw tightening by the time they reached the edge of town. They came down the main street in the flat afternoon light. And there on the bench outside Sheriff Aldis Pruitt's office, sitting with his hat turning slow circles in his hands and his eyes fixed on the ground, was a man Calhoun had never seen before. Desa had. He felt it before he saw it. A change in the quality of her breathing beside him, a single involuntary contraction, almost inaudible. He looked at her, and she had gone absolutely rigid in the saddle, her whole body pulled tight as wire under load. Her eyes fixed on the figure on the bench with an expression that had moved past shock and past fear into the territory of a person who has just understood in one clear moment the complete shape of what they are standing inside. Fletcher Vane looked up from the ground. He looked at Desa first, then at Greer, then briefly at Calhoun. His face held the expression of a man who had rehearsed something carefully and was no longer fully convinced by what he'd rehearsed. Calhoun looked at Greer. Greer was already looking at him, and there was something in Greer's face now for the first time, not triumph, not gloating, something more controlled than either of those. The quiet, settled confidence of a man who has done the preparation and is waiting for the rest of the world to arrive at the result he's already reached. Sutton Greer had never been behind Desa Vane. He had been in front of her the entire time. The ride-in had not been a concession to Calhoun's demand. It had been a walk to a location Greer had already prepared. The story waiting inside that office had not been Desa's story. It had been assembled and placed before she'd had the chance to speak a single word of her own. The question that settled over Calhoun as he stood in the afternoon heat with the sounds of the town around him was the kind that doesn't arrive loudly. It came the way the most consequential questions always come, quietly and without warning. How do you pull the truth back up when the lie has already been told first in a town where everyone already knows the family name? Sheriff Aldis Pruitt was not a man who could be read easily, and he had been that way long enough that most people in the county had stopped trying. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, thick through the chest, and deliberate in all his movements, with a face that had finished being expressive to strangers sometime around his 40th year and had settled into something more useful. The flat and patient attentiveness of a man who had decided that listening carefully was worth more than reacting quickly. He had been sheriff of this county for 11 years, which meant he had survived 3 different varieties of men who believed a badge was an opportunity, and he was still here, still wearing the same expression, still doing the job in the way of someone who had concluded long ago that doing it poorly was simply not a choice he was willing to make. Calhoun had observed him from a distance on a handful of occasions over 3 years and had formed a cautious respect for him, the kind of respect that doesn't require warmth, only recognition of something built correctly and intended to hold. But a man's character and his circumstances are different things, and Calhoun understood standing outside that office door with Fletcher Vane on the bench and the afternoon pressing down that whatever Pruitt had heard in the last several hours had been delivered by people with considerably more standing in this county than a woman with bare feet and a man who leased someone else's land. Fletcher Vane stood when they dismounted. He stood the way a person stands when they have been told to stand, the movement carrying the slight lag of someone executing instruction rather than responding to instinct. He was younger than Calhoun had expected, 30 or 32, lean and angular in the face, with eyes that were currently fixed on the middle distance in the careful way of a man holding a position he is not entirely comfortable in. He looked at Desa. Desa did not look back at him. She looked at the office door, and her face had gone still and composed in the particular way of a person who is deploying every available resource toward remaining functional and cannot afford to spend any of it on feeling. Greer dismounted smoothly and walked past all of them toward the office door as if arriving at a meeting he had called himself. One of his men tied the horses. The other, the one with the hurt arm, stayed near the street with the patient expression of a man accustomed to waiting. Calhoun put his hand briefly on Desa's arm as they moved toward the door. Not guiding, just present. She moved forward without acknowledging it, which was fine. Inside the office was dim after the brightness of the street. It smelled of wood smoke and old paper and the particular mineral quality of a room that had absorbed years of difficult conversations into its walls. There was a desk, 2 chairs, a rifle rack, and a door at the back leading to the 2-cell block that Puit maintained with the same utilitarian neatness as everything else about his operation. Puit stood behind his desk. He looked at each person who entered in sequence, not with alarm or welcome, just the flat and working attention of a man already processing what he was seeing. His eyes moved from Greer to Calhoun to Desa, and they stayed on Desa slightly longer than on either of the others. Calhoun noted that and counted it. Aldis, Greer said, and managed to make the familiarity of a first name sound less like warmth and more like a reminder of established geography. Sutton, Puit said, flat, then Mr. Briggs. He had been told about Calhoun, then with a register shift so small it was nearly invisible, ma'am. Fletcher came in last and positioned himself near the wall to the left, slightly behind the natural sight line of anyone facing Puit, a position that was present and absent at the same time. Greer spoke before anyone else could. I'm grateful for your time, Aldis. This is a private family matter that has drawn some outside involvement, and I think a few minutes of honest talk will settle it. It was well constructed. The framing arrived immediately decisively, and it placed everyone else in the room in a reactive position before a single fact had been established. Outside involvement. Not concern, not witness. Involvement as if Calhoun were an intrusion rather than a man. Puit looked at Greer, then at Calhoun. Mr. Briggs, tell me how you came to be part of this. I found this woman 200 yards from my fence line this morning, Calhoun said. She'd been on foot since before sunrise. She has injuries consistent with repeated and deliberate harm over time, not a single incident. And she has information I think needs to be heard directly from her. Pruitt's eyes went to Desa. Ma'am, are you here of your own will? Yes, Desa said. Immediate, clear. Puit nodded slowly as if confirming something he'd already suspected. He picked up a document from his desk, looked at it briefly, and set it down. I need to tell you both something before we go further. He was looking at Calhoun and Desa, not at Greer. This morning at approximately 6:45, Mr. Fletcher Vane came into this office and filed a complaint against his wife, Desa Vane, for theft of household property and abandonment of the marital home. The complaint was witnessed and signed. The room held that. Calhoun turned it over. Desa had arrived at his fence line around 8:30 at the earliest based on the sun's position. She had been running since before dawn, which meant Fletcher Vane had come to this office while his wife was still crossing open plain in the dark, before she had reached anywhere, before she had spoken to anyone, before she'd had any opportunity to speak for herself, in a situation he was filing against her, as if there were no version of it but his. He had not come here worried about a missing wife. He had come here with a prepared complaint, a signed document, at 6:45 in the morning. Calhoun said carefully, "What time did she leave the house?" Fletcher spoke from the wall. His voice was controlled but thin at the edges. "Around midnight. Without warning. She took money from the household account and a piece of jewelry belonging to my mother." A pause. "I tried to stop her. She was in a state." Calhoun looked at him. Fletcher did not meet his eyes. He was looking at a point on the floor in front of him, and his hands were turning his hat brim in a slow, restless rotation that seemed to be happening without his awareness. Desa said very quietly, "I took $4 in a tin cup. I left everything else." "Ma'am," Puit said not unkindly, "I need you to let me ask the questions right now." She closed her mouth. Her jaw stayed set. Puit turned to Calhoun. "You said she has injuries." "She does," Calhoun said. He kept his voice level factual, the register he had learned giving field reports under conditions designed to make level voices impossible. Consistent with repeated deliberate harm over an extended period. Layered old damage beneath fresh. Not accidental. Not a single incident. He paused. There are also injuries from this morning. Wire cuts, bruising from falls in the dark. She crossed rough country on bare feet for several hours. Pruitt was quiet. He had the expression of a man running a calculation he had hoped he wouldn't need to run. Then he looked at Greer. Sutton, why are you here personally for what you're calling a private family matter? A good question, a specific one. Arrived at quickly enough that Calhoun revised his estimate of the man upward by a degree. Greer said Fletcher is family. When there's trouble, I'm part of sorting it. Simple, reasonable. The tone of a man explaining something self-evident to someone polite enough not to have pressed. Pruitt held the look for a beat longer than necessary. Then I'm going to need to speak with Mrs. Vane privately. Of course, Greer said with the ease of a man who had no anxiety about what that would produce. That ease was the third time Calhoun had noticed it, and the third time it had produced the same cold sensation at the base of his neck. The sensation of ground that sounds wrong underfoot. Greer took his men to the porch. Fletcher remained by the wall because Pruitt's look told him to. Calhoun stayed because Pruitt hadn't told him not to. Pruitt pulled a chair around to the front of his desk and positioned it before Desa. He sat on the edge of the desk, bringing himself to roughly her eye level, an adjustment Calhoun noticed and filed away. Mrs. Vane, Pruitt said, tell me what happened. Start wherever it makes sense to start. Desa looked at him. That measuring look, the one that had been testing every door this entire day. Then something in her settled, not relaxed, but found its depth the way a foundation settles when it reaches solid ground. She talked for a long time. She talked the way someone talks who has been maintaining a careful account in their head for years with no opportunity to deliver it. Not with appeal, not with drama, but with the stripped-down precision of a person presenting facts to someone who might actually do something with them. 3 years of marriage to Fletcher Vane. The gradual understanding that Sutton Greer's presence in the household was not a temporary condition, but a permanent feature she had no authority over. The minister who had told her to be a better wife. The neighbor woman who had listened and then disappeared from her life within a week. The letter she had written 3 months ago to the district judge sent through the post office in town, which had never received a reply. She talked about the night before. When she finished, the room was quiet. Pruitt looked at the floor in front of him with the expression of a man completing an arithmetic he had been hoping would come out differently. Then he looked at Fletcher. Fletcher. Fletcher's hands went still on the hat brim. The complaint you filed this morning, 6:45. That's right. Your wife says she left around midnight. You filed roughly 6 hours later. I couldn't sleep, Fletcher said. I was worried. Uh-huh. Pruitt picked up the complaint document. This is written out in full. That's not your handwriting. Fletcher's jaw moved. I dictated it to someone who writes cleaner than I do. Pruitt set the document down. Who helped you write it? A pause with a shape to it. The shape of a man deciding how much of a smaller truth to offer to protect something larger. Sutton helped me put it in the right words, he said. I wasn't thinking straight. I didn't know what I was doing, Calhoun said from his position near the window. He filed a complaint about theft before his wife had reached anywhere, before she'd spoken to a single person, before she had any way to offer her side of a situation he was already framing against her. He kept his voice even. That is not a man worried about a missing wife. That is a man covering a position. Greer's voice came through the open window from the porch, not loud, just precisely present. Briggs, I'd suggest you let the law manage its own affairs. Pruitt said without raising his voice. I'd appreciate it if you waited outside Sutton. Quiet enough to be polite, clear enough to carry through the window. The flat authority of a man exercising jurisdiction in his own office. A silence from the porch, then boot heels moving away along the boards. Pruitt looked at Calhoun. You said there's documented injury. You can examine it yourself, Calhoun said. There's no interpretation required about what it is or how long it's been going on. Pruitt turned to Desa. Ma'am, I need to bring in someone I trust to document what you've described. I won't do that myself, and I wouldn't ask you to allow it. Do you know Birdie Holcomb? Desa shook her head slightly. She's helped this office before when we've needed a woman's assistance. I trust her judgment. I think you can too. He stood from the desk. I need a few minutes. He went out. The room held Calhoun and Desa and Fletcher Vane. The silence between them had a texture, the thick and complicated texture of 3 people who all possessed the same set of facts and were all aware that none of them were saying them. Fletcher stood by the wall with his hat in both hands, eyes down the hat's slow rotation, the only movement in him. Desa turned and looked at her husband. It was the first time she had looked at him directly since they'd arrived. Calhoun watched it happen, the long and level look that carried no accusation, because accusation was a thing that required energy she had long since stopped spending on him. The look was simply the look of a person delivering something that had been waiting a very long time to be delivered. She said very quietly, "Did you know last night?" Fletcher said nothing. "Did you tell him I was leaving?" His hands had stopped moving on the hat. He was completely still. "Fletcher," she said, same quiet, same level. "I need you to tell me that much." He raised his eyes from the floor. He looked at her. What was in his face was not cruelty, not the comfortable self-justification of a man who believes he's done no wrong. It was something closer to the expression of a man who has been holding something in a closed fist for so long the hand has forgotten how to open, and who has only in this moment understood what that sustained gripping has cost him. His throat worked. He looked back at the floor. Calhoun turned to the window and looked at the street. He did it to give Desa what privacy the room could offer, and because he needed a moment himself. The afternoon sun was hitting the street at the angle of mid-afternoon, and the ordinary business of a working town was moving around the hitched horses and the parked wagons without regard for what was happening in this office. Greer was not visible from this angle, which was not reassuring. A man like that didn't disappear when he moved out of your sightline. He simply stopped being visible. Birdie Holcomb arrived in less time than Puit had estimated. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, gray hair managed with practical efficiency, with eyes that had seen enough of the world to be neither impressed nor unsettled by new additions to their experience. She came in, took in the room in one sweep, went directly to Desa and said, "Come on back with me," and led her through Pruitt's door to the back without ceremony or preamble. It was while they were back there that Greer came in. He came through the front door alone, closed it quietly behind him, and crossed to the far corner of the room with the deliberate purpose of a man who had been waiting for a specific moment and had decided it had arrived. He glanced at Puit, who was back behind his desk. He glanced at Fletcher, still at the wall. Then he looked at Calhoun and tilted his head very slightly toward the corner. Calhoun crossed the room and stood there, and Greer positioned himself at an angle that put his back to Puit and Fletcher, creating the kind of privacy that exists between two people in a room full of others when neither of them raises his voice. Up close, the scar along Greer's cheekbone was more visible. Pale, precise, the work of something edged, moving fast. His eyes were light gray or pale green, and they had the quality of deep and still water, not peaceful but without surface movement, because everything was happening underneath. He said quietly, "You were at Chikamaga." Not a question. Calhoun said nothing. "September 1863, Greer said. 19th Corps Field Station, Eastern Ridge. You were investigated by the military board in '64. Dereliction of duty in the field. The finding was inconclusive. Charges were not brought." A pause. "The record still exists." Calhoun kept his face still. "There are people in this county," Greer said, "who have extended this family trust and standing across many years. People who would find it informative to know that the man standing up in that office, on behalf of a woman in a domestic matter, has a history that raises questions about his character and his judgment in the field." He let that land. "You stand up in this room today, Briggs, and that record becomes the most interesting piece of paper in Cheyenne by the end of this week." The room was quiet around them. Calhoun could hear Fletcher's hat rotating again. He could hear the faint sound of voices from the back room. Birdie Holcomb's even and unhurried tone, Desa's answers coming in short, steady sentences. He could hear the street outside, the completely ordinary sounds of a town going about a completely ordinary afternoon. He looked at Sutton Greer. He took in the pale eyes and the measuring calm, and the precise and bloodless quality of the threat delivered without heat, which made it more serious rather than less. He took in the man's complete ease, the absence of doubt, the posture of a man who had arrived at this moment, knowing exactly what he held and exactly what it was worth. And Calhoun thought about Chikamaga. He thought about the ridge and the smoke, and the particular terrible sound of a large engagement in dense woodland where you could never see far enough to understand the full shape of what was happening around you. He thought about the man he had passed on his way back from the forward station, a Union infantryman down in the brush 20 feet off the path with a chest wound that was bad but survivable with immediate attention. He thought about the calculation he had performed in that moment, the field medic's arithmetic. There are more people at the station. I will come back. Someone else will find him. The efficient choice is to continue. He had gone back 2 hours later. The man had been dead for at least one of them. For 15 years, he had built an elaborate and internally consistent argument for why the choice he had made was the reasonable one. The mathematics of field medicine, the rational allocation of limited resources, the kind of decision any competent person in those conditions would have made. The argument was architecturally sound. It held up under examination. It had been sufficient for most of the nights. But it had never been the whole truth. And he had always known the distance between the argument and the whole truth, even when he was most successfully not looking at it. He looked past Greer's shoulder at the closed door to the back room. Through it, barely audible, he could hear Desa's voice. Steady, still answering. Still holding herself together with the same specific and persistent discipline she had been holding herself together with since that rock by the dry creek bed. The discipline of someone for whom not giving up had long since stopped being a choice and had become simply the condition of continuing to exist. He looked back at Greer. He said nothing. He turned and walked back to his position near the front window and stood there with his arms loose at his sides. Greer remained in the corner for a moment. Then he walked to the door and stepped back onto the porch. When Birdie came back out with Desa, she went directly to Pruitt's desk and placed her hands flat on its surface and looked at him the way a woman looks at someone she is about to give a verdict to. "It's real bad," she said. "Consistent, deliberate, and long-standing. I'll sign a statement with my full name." Pruitt sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling briefly with the expression of a man having a difficult confirmation confirmed. Then he looked at the complaint on his desk, then at Fletcher Vane. Fletcher was no longer looking at the floor. He was looking at Desa, and in his face was something that had not been there before, something beyond guilt, because guilt has a self-protective quality, a tendency to reshape itself into something the person carrying it can manage. What was in Fletcher's face now was simpler and more costly than guilt. It was the expression of a man looking at the full price of what he had chosen for the first time, without the buffer of distance, and finding it considerably larger than he had agreed to pay. Pruitt said, "Fletcher, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think before you answer." Fletcher's eyes moved to him. "The complaint you filed this morning, did you file it because you believed your wife had done something wrong?" A pause. "Or did you file it because you were told to?" The room held that question. Fletcher's hands went still on the hat brim. His face ran through something complicated and internal, several versions of himself arguing in real time about which one was going to have to stand here and answer. He looked at the front door through which Sutton Greer was standing on the porch in the afternoon heat. Then he looked back at Pruitt, and something in him gave. Not cleanly, not completely, but structurally the way timber gives when the load finally exceeds the grain's capacity. Not a dramatic split, but a fundamental compromise. His voice when it came was rough and fractured in the way of a man who has been holding something in a closed fist for a very long time. "He told me the night before," Fletcher said. "He told me she was going to try to run." A pause. "He told me what to do if she did. He told me to come here first, before she could." The room was quiet with that. Pruitt wrote something in long, deliberate strokes on the paper in front of him. Then he stood, went to the door, and stepped out onto the porch. Through the window, Calhoun watched Pruitt say something to Greer in a voice too low to reach the glass. He watched Greer's face, visible in profile, move through a controlled transition from confidence into something more careful, more calculating, a man doing rapid arithmetic on changed conditions. He watched Pruitt's hand settle on Greer's arm, steady and without drama. He watched Greer turn from the railing. Desa had come to stand beside Calhoun. She had done it without announcement, simply placed herself there, the way you place yourself somewhere solid when the ground has been uncertain for a long time. They watched through the glass together. Just before Pruitt moved Greer through the door and toward the back, Greer stopped. He turned and looked through the window directly at Calhoun. Their eyes met across the distance through the glass, and Greer said something. He said it without raising his voice, without urgency in the same even and considered tone he used for everything. Calhoun could not hear the words through the glass. He could read them. "I know what you left behind at Chikamaga." Calhoun held the look and did not look away, and after a moment Pruitt's hand moved Greer forward, and they passed through the back door, and then there was just the street outside, and the ordinary afternoon light, and the sounds of the town going about its business, as if nothing in that office had just shifted. Desa said very quietly beside him. What did he say? Calhoun looked at the empty street for a moment. Something he thought would land harder than it did, he said. The sun was getting low by the time they rode out of Cheyenne. Not all the way down. Low enough that the light had changed from the flat white pressure of midday into something longer and more considered, the kind that finds angles in the landscape and makes them briefly visible in ways the noon sun never bothers with. The shadows of their horses ran long and ahead of them on the pale road, and the dry grass on either side caught the light and held it for a moment before releasing it. There were three of them, Calhoun, Desa, and Birdie Holcomb, who had offered her place without framing it as charity, which was the reason Desa had accepted. Birdie rode slightly ahead in the way of a woman who had been making her own decisions on her own land long enough that forward motion had become her natural position. No one talked much on the ride. There is a particular silence that follows the conclusion of something difficult. Not the silence of emptiness, but of a space that has just been cleared, where things that needed to be said have been said, and the air is still settling around their absence. Calhoun rode and watched the road and let the silence do what silence does when you give it room. Desa rode between them. She sat with more height in her spine than she had that morning, not because the pain had eased, he didn't imagine it had, but because something in the structure of how she was carrying herself had changed. Not relief yet. Relief came slowly after sustained fear, the way feeling returns slowly to a limb that had been compressed for a long time. But something in that direction, something that might become it. Birdie's place sat a mile east of Calhoun's, a working piece of land she had held for 22 years, through a series of difficulties she mentioned occasionally in passing and never with complaint. The house was solid and low-built, with the unpretentious practicality of someone who had decided a house was a tool and should be constructed accordingly. There was a barn, a vegetable garden that was producing better than the season deserved, and a dog of indeterminate breed and advanced age who observed their arrival from the porch steps with the philosophical detachment of an animal that has seen enough arrivals to know they are not generally cause for ceremony. Birdie took the horses. Calhoun carried the water bucket. Desa walked up the porch steps with one hand on the rail, her body finally doing the accounting of a long day that she hadn't allowed it to do while they were still inside that office. In the kitchen, Birdie moved with the efficiency of someone who had fed people in difficult circumstances before. Water on the stove, bread on the table, a jar of last summer's preserves set beside it without comment. She went to the back briefly and returned with a folded blanket and a change of clothes, practical work clothes that would be too wide but would serve, and set them at the end of the bench near Desa. Desa looked at her. Birdie said, "Washrooms through there. Take your time." Desa picked up the clothes. She stood holding them for a moment, and something crossed her face, brief and complicated and gone before it fully formed. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Nothing to thank me for," Birdie said in the tone of a woman who meant it literally, and went back to the stove. Desa went through to the washroom. Calhoun sat at the kitchen table, and Birdie set 2 cups of coffee down and sat across from him, and they drank in the easy silence of people who had been through a long day together and had no need to summarize it. The kitchen was warm with the stove's heat, and outside the window the evening was coming in across the plain, in the gradual way of plains evenings, the light going from gold to copper to something quieter. After a while, Birdie said, "Puit will hold him." "For now," Calhoun said. "The letter." Birdie wrapped both hands around her cup. "Correspondence intercepted before it could reach a district official. That's federal grounds if Puit wants to go that direction. And he will. He's been waiting for something solid on the Greer family for a long time. He knows what they are. He needed something he could stand behind in a courtroom. There'll be more than one letter," Calhoun said, "if someone looks at the postal records properly." "Someone will," Birdie said. She looked at her cup for a moment. "You did a hard thing today." "I did the necessary thing." "Those tend to be the same things," she said. "That's what makes them hard." She picked up her cup and went to the stove, and that was the end of that conversation, which was the right way to end it. Desa came back out wearing Birdie's clothes, her hair down and still damp at the ends. The change was not superficial. Removed from the evidence of the morning's emergency, she was more fully visible as herself, the woman who had been present inside the other one all day, the one with the sharp eyes and the precise language, and the composure that had kept reasserting itself regardless of what it was working against. Birdie put food in front of her, and she ate without self-consciousness, which Calhoun respected. Hunger was a fact, and she treated it as one. They ate without much talk, which was its own kind of conversation. Afterward, Birdie cleared the table and moved to the back of the house with the tact of a woman who understood when a room needed to hold fewer people. And Calhoun and Desa were left with the lamp burning low between them and the sound of the evening plane outside the night wind in the grass, the creak of old wood doing what old wood does as the temperature dropped. Desa said after a while, "What happens to Fletcher?" Calhoun thought it through. Depends on how much he tells Pruitt and how much he decides to protect. He was part of the mechanism even if he wasn't its engine. Pruitt won't pretend otherwise. Desa was quiet. "He's not a bad man," she said. Then with careful precision, "He's something different from a bad man. He's a man who understood the difference between right and wrong and chose wrong because right cost more than he was willing to spend." Calhoun looked at her. "I used to think those were the same," she said. "Bad men and men who make bad choices. I don't think that anymore. A bad man doesn't know what he is. A man who knows and chooses anyway carries that knowledge. And what he does with it is either the beginning of something or the end." He considered that. It was the kind of distinction that appeared simple until you held it up to the light, and then it opened into something larger and less comfortable. He thought about Fletcher's face in that office, the thing that had broken through the surface of it, the exhaustion underneath the compliance. Whether that crack was the first opening of something worth building, or just the evidence of a long structural failure finally becoming visible. That was Fletcher's question to answer, not his. Calhoun got up and refilled his cup and stood at the window. The moon was up nearly full, and it laid enough light across the plain that the grass was visible pale and moving the low shapes of the land, finding definition in the silver. He could see the outline of his own barn from here a quarter-mile east, a dark form against the slightly lighter dark of the sky. Desa said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." A pause. The lamp made a small sound, the wick adjusting. Desa looked at the table, then up at him, and her eyes in the lamplight had the quality of eyes that have considered whether to ask something and decided on asking. "Why didn't you go," she said, "when he told you what he'd do, when he said he'd put that record in front of the whole county?" She let that sit. "You could have stepped back. You'd already done more than anyone else had. Nobody would have faulted you for it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he came back to the table and sat down and looked at the grain of the wood in front of him. He had not spoken about Chikamaga to another person in 15 years, not the real version, not the version stripped of the framework of military necessity and field mathematics that he had built around it, like walls around something that couldn't be left in the open air. The framework had served its purpose. But there was something about this room and this conversation and the specific quality of the attention this woman paid to things that made the framework feel beside the point. Not wrong, just no longer load-bearing. He said, "There was a man at Chikamaga, September 63. I was moving back toward the field station from the forward line, and I found him in the brush off the path. Union infantry, chest wound bad but survivable with immediate attention." He stopped. "I had 3 units waiting on me at the station, and I was carrying reports that couldn't wait, and I made the calculation that going back was the efficient choice, that the math said I was worth more at the station than I was in that brush for one man." Desa was completely still. "I went back 2 hours later," Calhoun said. "He'd been dead for one of them." He looked at his cup. "The military board investigated in 64. The finding was inconclusive. They concluded the conditions made it a defensible field decision. They put their names on it, and that became the official version." He looked up. "The official version and what I know are not the same document," he said. "I have known that every single day for 15 years. I built a life out here away from situations that would ask me to make that kind of decision again, because I had decided at a level I didn't examine directly that I was not the man for those moments, that I was the man who calculated rather than the man who acted." He paused. "And then this morning I was mending a fence, and something went down in the grass 200 yards out, and I stood there for a moment running the calculation." He looked at her directly. "And I understood that if I walked away from that, I would be confirming something about myself that I had been arguing against for 15 years, and the argument would be finished, and I would know for the rest of whatever time I have exactly and completely what kind of man I am." The room held that. "So I didn't walk away," he said. "Not because I was brave, because I couldn't carry what it would cost me if I did." Desa looked at him for a long time. Not with pity, not with the softened, reflective response that people sometimes offer when they've heard something difficult, which always felt to him more like a mirror than a presence. People showing you their reaction rather than sitting inside what you'd actually said. She looked at him the way she had looked at everything all day, straight on, without flinching, with the full attention of someone for whom seeing things accurately had been for a long time a survival skill rather than a preference. "You've been carrying that man as a verdict," she said. He thought about that word, verdict, the finality of it, the way it closed something off. "Yes," he said, "and today you wanted to carry him differently." He looked at the table. "I don't know if one thing cancels another. I don't think it works that way." He paused. "But I think you can add to the record. I think you can make it more complete over time if you keep choosing. And I think a more complete record is worth something, even when it doesn't settle the account." Desa was quiet for a moment. "I showed you my back this morning," she said, "because I had shown it to 3 people in 3 years, and every one of them decided it wasn't their problem." A pause. "A minister, a neighbor woman, a man at the land office I thought might help." She looked at her hands on the table. "I stopped believing it would change anything. I did it because it was the last true thing I had. A real thing in a situation full of arranged versions of the truth." She looked up. "You looked at it," she said, "and you didn't arrange it into something more manageable. You just looked at what it actually was." A pause. "That is not a small thing. I want you to know that." He nodded once. They sat with that for a while, the lamp between them, the plain outside the window full of the ordinary sounds of a Wyoming night, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed saying in that moment. And they were both people who understood the difference between a silence that was empty and a silence that was full. Calhoun slept in the barn on the bedroll he kept in his saddlebag, which was comfortable enough and which suited him in the way that sleeping at a slight remove from things generally suited him. He lay in the dark and listened to the horses in the barn settling and the wind working through the gaps in the siding, and he let the day move through him without examining it, the way you let water move through country following whatever level it finds. He slept better than he had in years. In the weeks that followed, the matter moved at the pace that justice moves in a small county, when it is working the way it's supposed to, which is to say without drama, but with accumulating weight. Puit filed a formal complaint with the district court in Laramie on the second day, citing Birdie Holcomb's signed witness statement, the documented injuries, Fletcher Vane's partial admission, and the intercepted letter as grounds for charges against Sutton Greer. The letter, once it entered the official record, developed a life of its own. Desa had sent it through the Cheyenne post office 3 months earlier, addressed to the district judge, and it had not arrived. The postal inspector's office in Denver found that question sufficiently interesting to investigate, and what the investigation turned up was not one letter but seven pieces of correspondence sent through that office over 4 years and intercepted before delivery. Hector Greer, who managed the postal window, was a meticulous man in his particular way. He had kept records of every piece of correspondence he had held or redirected, which was both the most damning and the least explicable aspect of the whole arrangement, and those records, once discovered, became the foundation upon which the rest of the legal case was constructed. The district court found them considerably more interesting than Sutton Greer's attorney found comfortable. Greer's lawyer came up from Cheyenne and made arguments about jurisdiction and the interpretation of testimony from a witness of, he said, questionable stability. Puit submitted Birdie Holcomb's statement with her full name, 22 years of county residence, and a list of 17 individuals prepared to testify to her character. The lawyer made additional arguments. The district judge read everything submitted and reached a conclusion. Sutton Greer was held on charges serious enough that bail was set at a figure designed to be inconvenient even for a man of his resources. Fletcher Vane cooperated fully with Puit in the second week. Not because he had become someone different, but because the person he had always been, the one underneath the compliance and the fear, had apparently been waiting for a long time for the structure he'd been propping up to show him it was coming down with or without his help. His testimony filled in gaps that would have taken significantly longer to establish by other means. He did not receive forgiveness for this because forgiveness was not within Puit's official capacity to offer and was not within Desa's immediate or perhaps near future willingness to give. But he received acknowledgement, which is a different and in some ways more honest thing. He was a man who had known the difference between right and wrong and had chosen wrong because right cost more than he'd been willing to spend. What he did with that knowledge going forward was his own question to answer. Desa stayed at Birdie's place. She stayed at first because there was nowhere immediately available that made more sense, and then because it began to make its own sense. Birdie had been running a two-person operation alone for several years since her son had gone to Colorado, and Desa had a practical competence in working land that had been comprehensively underutilized during 3 years in the Vane household, where she had been managed rather than put to use. They worked together with the direct efficiency of two people who understood each other's approach without requiring negotiation. Birdie taught things and Desa learned them with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting a long time to be permitted to learn. She was particularly good with the horses, which Birdie noted with approval and did not make a production of. The change in Desa happened gradually, which is how change actually happens when it is real rather than performed. Not in visible markers, not with a clean line between before and after. More like the slow and slightly uneven process of ground recovering after a long drought, 2 good days and 1 hard one, then 3 good days, then 4, until the average of the days began to be different from what it had been. The first visible thing was how she stood. The particular inward contraction she had carried through the first days, the physical residue of a long habit of making herself smaller. In spaces she shared with other people began to release. By the end of the first month, she stood with the full height of her spine and occupied whatever space she was in without the apologetic quality that had been present before. She spoke differently, too. Not louder, but with a directness that had been present in the first day's emergency, submerged briefly under the weight of its aftermath, and then surfaced again and stayed. She said what she meant without the layer of softening qualification that women in her situation learn to apply to everything they say in order to make it acceptable to people who hold authority over them. She said it and stopped, and she held the silence that followed without filling it with reassurance. Calhoun saw her several times a week in the natural way of neighboring. He helped Birdie reset a section of fence along the north boundary. He cut posts for a new shelter structure they were building on the east side. He ate at their table on Sunday evenings because Birdie had invited him once, and then simply continued to expect it, which suited him considerably better than if she had made a recurring occasion of it. He watched Desa without performing the watching. The way you watch something that has been through a serious storm and is finding its new shape with honest attention and without sentiment, and without the kind of interference that disguises itself as care. He did not press anything between them. He did not manage the space of it. He let it be what it was at each moment, which was something he was capable of now. In a way, he had not always been a patience. That was not detachment, but rather the knowledge that some things require time, the way ground requires rain, and that hurrying them produces less rather than more. He was aware that something existed between them. He was aware of it the way he was aware of a change in the air before weather arrived, present, but not yet defined, not yet requiring a name. He didn't name it or calculate it. He let the days be what they were, and found that the days were more satisfying than they had previously been, which was its own kind of information and sufficient for the time being. 3 months after the morning on the rock, on an evening in early October, when the light had turned to the specific quality of Wyoming autumn, which is unlike any other light in any other season, Calhoun was standing at the fence line where he had first seen Desa go down. He had not planned to be there. He had been working along the south boundary all afternoon, and the work had brought him here naturally, the way honest work moves you toward what needs doing without requiring you to choose it consciously. He was assessing a post that needed resetting before the ground froze, turning the problem over when he heard footsteps in the dry grass behind him. He turned. Desa was walking across the plain from the direction of Birdie's place. She wore a jacket against the October air, her dark hair loose at her shoulders, and she moved with that quality she had been finding over the past months, the quality of a person moving through space they have earned the right to be in. She came up beside him and stood for a moment looking out at the plain, the way people look when they are organizing what they mean to say. The light was coming in from the west at the long October angle, finding the dry grass and the flat rock, and the pale line of the creek bed, holding them briefly in that specific gold before releasing them. Desa said, "I've been thinking about that morning." He waited. "About what I thought I was doing when I showed you what I showed you." She kept her eyes on the plain. "I thought I was presenting evidence of something destroyed, making the case that there was nothing left worth standing up for." She turned and looked at him with those direct and level eyes. "I've decided I was wrong about that." He looked at her. "What I was actually showing you," she said, "was something that was still there, still present, still holding its shape under everything that had been done to it over 3 years." She paused. I was showing you something that had not given up, even when I was almost entirely certain that I had." He was quiet for a moment. He looked out across the plain at the rock by the creek bed, at the flat reach of the land, going quietly gold in the evening, and he thought about the morning on the fence line, the shape going down in the grass 200 yards out, the moment he had stood still and made the small and entirely ordinary decision to walk toward it instead of away. "Not many people come through what you came through," he said, "and arrive at the other side with that much of themselves still intact." She said, "I'm not sure how much of that is me and how much of it is having someone stand in the right place at the right time." He shook his head slowly. "Standing in the right place doesn't give a person what you have," he said. "It only gives them the room to use it." She considered that, looked back at the plain. "I think I'm going to be all right," she said. He looked out at the long, flat reach of the land, the last of the October light moving across it, the grass bending in the evening wind. "I know you are," he said. They stood where they were, side by side on the ground where everything had started. She did not reach for his hand. He did not reach for hers. They stood in the October light, and neither of them moved to close the remaining distance, because the distance was the right distance for this moment, and this moment was the right moment for what it was, and neither of them was in a hurry to make it into something beyond what it actually was. Present, alive, standing on ground they had both in their different ways earned the right to be on. The sun touched the rim of the earth, and the gold went out of the grass the way it always went without ceremony, just the light leaving and the dust coming in behind it. They stood there while it happened. Two people on a piece of Wyoming ground in October, watching the day end, where a different kind of day had once ended, and a different kind of beginning had quietly, without announcement, started.